Well, sometimes in the world of politics, you think you've seen it all, and then something pops up that's just completely out of left field.
Yeah.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into one of those curveballs. We're talking about a pretty controversial move from the Trump administration, a program that's been dubbed a deferred resignation program for federal workers. And the whole thing started with a rather eyebrow-raising email with a very simple title, Fork in the Road.
Fork in the road, that's a pretty evocative title. It really sets the stage for a big decision. And that's exactly what we're going to unpack in this deep dive. We're going to go beyond the surface level, get into the details of what this program actually entails, look at the legal challenges that have already emerged, and try to give you a clear understanding of what's at stake.
Absolutely. And our main source for all of this is going to be a recent YouTube video transcript from Glenn Kirshner, someone who's been following this story very closely. So let's start right at the beginning with this fork in the road email. What exactly was being offered to these federal employees?
So this email landed in the inboxes of federal government employees on January 28th, 2025. And it gave them a pretty limited time frame to make a decision. The deadline was February 6th, 2025. So just over a week to decide whether or not they wanted to resign in September of that same year.
Okay.
But here's the really interesting part, as the transcript highlights. Those who accepted this offer, they would actually continue to receive their full pay and benefits
Wow.
from the moment they said yes until that September resignation date,
No way.
all while doing very little, if any, actual work.
So basically getting paid to not work for 8 months.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
And the way they were supposed to accept this offer was almost too simple. It's almost unbelievable.
How so? How did it work?
All they had to do was reply to that email from their government account and just type one word, resign. That was it. Hit send by February 6th, and that's it. You're in the program.
That's really strange. Just resign, and that's all it took.
That's all it took.
Wow. So you can imagine that raised some red flags, right? There had to be some kind of catch. And then on top of this initial email, you have the Office of Personnel Management, the OPM, issuing some follow-up communications. What did they have to say?
Yeah, so the OPM followed up with some messages, basically trying to reassure federal employees about this program. They explicitly stated that those who opted for this deferred resignation, they would in fact receive their full government salary for those 8 months leading up to their September departure, even if they weren't, actively working.
Okay.
And that's where the alarm bells start ringing even louder, because our source, Kirshner, he actually uses some pretty strong language. He calls this potential fraud, waste, and abuse.
Fraud, waste, and abuse. That's a serious accusation. Why such a strong reaction?
Well, think about it from the perspective of a taxpayer. The idea of having a potentially large number of federal employees receiving their full salaries for months without actually doing their jobs, it does raise some serious questions about how responsibly those public funds are being used.
Yeah, for sure.
The whole concept of work for pay is being challenged here. And unsurprisingly, this move didn't go unchallenged. You had major federal worker unions stepping up to fight back.
Okay, so which unions are we talking about here, and what actions did they take?
We're talking about some of the biggest names in federal worker unions. The American Federation of Government Employees, AFGE, the National Association of Government Employees, ANEG, and the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFCME. These are the big players, and they all filed lawsuits.
Lawsuits. What were they hoping to achieve with those?
Their main goal is to get an injunction, a court order, that would essentially block the Trump administration from implementing this deferred resignation program. They're calling the whole thing an illegal ultimatum.
Illegal ultimatum. That's pretty strong wording. What's the basis of their argument? What exactly are the unions saying is wrong with this program?
Their main point is that this, what they call the fork directive, amounts to forcing a huge number of federal employees to choose between resigning now or potentially losing their jobs without any compensation later on.
So they're saying it's a coercive tactic and one that's probably not even legal.
Exactly. And they have some pretty strong legal arguments to back that up.
Okay, let's get into some of those legal details. The transcript mentions the Anti-Deficiency Act. What's the connection there?
The Anti-Deficiency Act, that's a really important law. What it does is it prevents federal agencies from spending money that hasn't been explicitly approved by Congress.
Okay.
And the unions are arguing that when this offer was made, the government was actually operating on a temporary funding measure that was set to expire on March 14th. So basically, they're saying the administration was promising salaries and benefits to these workers for a period that went beyond that expiration date using funds that hadn't been fully authorized by Congress.
So they were essentially trying to spend money they didn't even have yet.
That's the argument. And the unions are saying that's a clear violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act, a blatant disregard for fiscal responsibility.
Right. So you've got potential problems with the funding itself, but there are also some ethical issues that have been raised, especially when it comes to the possibility of employees taking on second jobs.
Absolutely. The OPM, in their messaging, they actually suggested that employees who took this deal could potentially get second jobs while they were still receiving their federal salary.
Really?
But the unions pointed out that that's a problem because federal ethics rules, generally speaking, they put limits on outside employment for government workers.
Yeah, I can see why, to prevent conflicts of interest.
Exactly. So the question is, was the administration essentially encouraging behavior that would normally be prohibited? It's a real ethical gray area.
So you've got potential legal violations, ethical concerns, and it sounds like there was a real lack of trust when it came to the administration's motives. People were understandably worried that they wouldn't actually follow through on their promises.
Absolutely. There was a lot of skepticism, a lot of concern that the Trump administration might not actually deliver on those promises of full pay and benefits.
Yeah, given their track record, it's hard to blame people for being a bit wary.
Right. And the unions were basically saying, look, why should these federal employees have any faith that those payments will continue for the full 8 months?
Good point. And on top of all of that, there was some language in the OPM email that a lot of people found pretty offensive.
Oh, yeah, this was a big one.
What was it? What did they say?
In the same email where they're making this offer, the OPM also encouraged employees to find a job in the private sector as soon as you would like to do so.
Wow. That's already pretty dismissive of public service, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
But the real kicker was this line. The way to greater American prosperity is encouraging people to move from lower productivity jobs in the public sector to higher productivity jobs in the private sector.
Lower productivity jobs. That's a pretty harsh assessment of the work that people do in public service.
Yeah, and understandably, a lot of people were deeply offended by that. The idea that federal employees, many of whom have dedicated decades of their lives to serving the public, that they're in lower productivity jobs, it was seen as deeply disrespectful, devaluing their contributions. Kirshner's transcript really reflects that outrage. It's hard not to feel for these public servants being talked to like that.
It's really demoralizing, isn't it? And beyond the insult, it seems like the administration wasn't really addressing some very practical concerns that these employees would naturally have about making such a big decision.
Yeah, there were a lot of unanswered questions. Things like, how would this affect their pensions? What about their health insurance? Would it impact their retirement eligibility? What about their service tenure or their rights to be reinstated later on?
Those are huge life decisions.
They are. And according to Kirshner, the administration's response was basically, just shut up, write, resign, and hit send, or we can't guarantee your job.
Wow.
There was a real lack of consideration for the impact this would have on people's lives and careers.
So despite all of this pressure, this sort of take it or leave it attitude, did many federal employees actually accept this offer?
Well, the good news is, it seems like it wasn't as widespread as maybe the administration had hoped. Kirshner's transcript mentions some reporting that suggests only a small percentage of federal workers actually took the deal.
Okay, so maybe some pushback worked. Maybe people were just too skeptical of the terms or too committed to their jobs to just walk away like that.
Could be both. And the lawsuits filed by the unions, Kirshner sees those as part of a broader resistance to this kind of approach.
People standing up for themselves, saying enough is enough.
Exactly. And this whole situation, this controversial offer, the OPM's attempts to downplay the concerns, it all led to a pretty significant backlash. And that brings us to the legal challenges, which are really at the heart of this story.
So this whole thing is really about people fighting back against what they see as an abuse of power.
Yeah, Kirshner frames these lawsuits as evidence of individuals and organizations standing up to Trump's lawlessness, what they see as an attempt to intimidate people. These federal employees, through their unions, they're saying justice matters. And they're arguing that this program crossed the line, both legally and ethically.
So let's take a moment to summarize what we've learned here. We've talked about the details of this fork in the road email, the OPM's attempts to reassure people, the legal challenges from the unions focusing on the funding and the ethics of it all, the warnings that the administration might not even keep their promises, and the frankly offensive language that was used to try to justify the whole thing. And on a slightly more positive note, it seems like the program itself wasn't all that successful in the end.
Yeah, that's a good summary. This deep dive has really uncovered a very controversial initiative by the Trump administration. This deferred resignation program was a pretty radical attempt to reshape the federal workforce, but it was met with immediate and strong opposition. The federal employee unions, they weren't going to stand for it, and they launched a pretty serious legal challenge based on some very real concerns.
And so, as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's worth considering the bigger picture. What would happen if programs like this became more common? What does this whole episode tell us about how public service is viewed or maybe devalued by some people in power? It's definitely food for thought.
It really is. It makes you think about the long-term impact on public service, on the relationship between the government and its employees. If this kind of thing becomes the norm, what does that mean for the stability and effectiveness of our civil service?
It's a great question.
This whole episode forces us to examine the value that we place on public service and to think about the consequences of treating dedicated public servants in this way.
It's something we all need to think about.
It really is.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.